Hey Eastside, my name's Josh, and so glad that you joined us today. I know that in my life, with all the things that there are to do, it is so helpful to have this time each week to just hit pause, reflect, and really refocus on the things that matter most in life, and to do so with others who, thanks to technology, are watching this from different locations all around the world. And my prayer is that you would experience God's leading today, as we conclude this series that we've been in together. But before we jump into our message today, I do want to let you know that next week at every Eastside campus, including online, we are beginning a new series through the Old Testament book of Nehemiah that's called All In. And this is a tremendous story about what can happen when everyone rallies together to help rebuild what's been ruined. And here's what's just so inspiring about it. The story, it's not just about what happens collectively when everyone is all in together. It's also about what happens individually as you and I participate. And I just want to let you know, this isn't just a series. We've developed small group study to go along with it. We're going to have 21 days of prayer with a worship night coming up in the midst of it. There's even a digital guidebook that you'll be able to download with questions for your family, and you can discuss them with your kids. And I'm telling you right now, if you truly go all in, I believe that this has the capacity to be one of the most spiritually defining seasons for you, as well as for our church. And so I hope that you'll join us next week. But today, I want to begin with a question. And here's the question I want to begin with today. What if we could predict our own future? What if you could predict your own future? Maybe a better way of asking this would be, what if you could see what your life would look like 5 years from now, or even 10 years from now, or perhaps even at the end of your life? What if we could predict our own future? Now, on one hand, this may seem pretty far-fetched. I think many of us have actually gotten much closer to predicting our own future than we realize. And the reason that I believe that is because every one of us at some point in our lives have either said or thought this phrase, "I should have seen that coming." Right? And if you've never said that before, I can guarantee you that you have said, or at least have thought this before, that they should have seen that coming. And here's the deal. If we really believe that, if we really believe that we or they should have seen something coming, then it must be possible for us, at least to some degree, to predict our own future, to know where it is that we're going to end up in life. A number of years ago, Pastor Andy Stanley wrote a book called The Principle of the Path. And in this book, he describes a principle that on one hand, it is so obvious, and yet on the other hand, it's often so neglected. And the principle is this, that direction determines destination. In other words, we can know where we're going to go in life based on the roads or based on the paths that we choose to travel. Now, it is worth noting that there are many things in our lives that are completely outside of our control. We have no control over where we were born, raised, what kind of family we grew up in. You have no control over what someone else may think or feel or act. Obviously, we can't control the weather or how fast time flies or the medical challenges that we may face. We may be able to influence some of those things, but we can't control them. However, there's a lot of research that would suggest that we make about, get this, 35,000 decisions a day. And so when you consider the number of decisions that we make and the number of actions that we're able to take, I think it's fair to say that we are able to determine our direction, which will ultimately determine our destination. It's no surprise to me that Proverbs 4:26 tells us, "Give careful thought to the paths for your feet and be steadfast in all your ways." Why? Because every path has a trajectory. And if our trajectory is not in line with our desired destination, then friends, we've got to find a new path. This principle, it's even found in the teachings of Jesus. Jesus alludes to the fact that we can, with a great deal of certainty, predict where we will end up in life. And I don't know what you believe about Jesus today, but regardless of what you think about God and the church or the Bible, even if you're completely skeptical, I hope that you'll consider what he has to say. Because I am just completely convinced that following the way of Jesus has the best trajectory for our life. Now, if you have a Bible with you today, or maybe you've got that Eastside app, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 7. And if you've been with us throughout this series, you know we've been looking at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is really a call to swim upstream, thus the name of the series that we're in. And we see that the teachings of Jesus, they are radically countercultural. And really, at times, they're even counterintuitive. He begins his message with the Beatitudes, right? These character traits of those who are blessed. And then Jesus taught how those who are blessed are to be a blessing, which is what we looked at last week. But this week, we are skipping to the very end of Jesus' message. I mean, it's how he wraps up this whole thing. And I would encourage you to go back and to read the heart of the message. Jesus gives so much practical instruction. I mean, he addresses some relational issues. He addresses heart issues, equality issues. He portrays what a spiritually mature lifestyle looks like. You know, how to live richly and how to live without worry. And over again, when you look through his teachings, he just continues to flip the script on the cultural norm. But then here we are, we get to the end of Jesus' sermon when he's landing the plan on everything that he's taught. And he concludes with a parable, with a metaphor, really, to help us understand how we should respond. And so let's go ahead and jump in together. Matthew 7, beginning in verse 24. It says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man." And so Jesus, he begins this parable acknowledging that the wise person is not just someone who hears his words or understands his words. The wise person is the one who puts the words of Jesus into practice. And I know that you know this, right? There is a big difference between hearing and doing. However, because we live in a world that emphasizes that knowledge is power, many times we equate knowledge with wisdom. In fact, we may even see them as synonymous or even interchangeable terms, that if I know, then I am wise. In fact, if we're not careful, that's exactly how we'll approach our faith. As long as I know the basic teachings of Christianity, if I just read the Bible and understand it, if I can articulate, this theological point of view, then I've got a solid faith. The reality, though, which we've all experienced in some way, shape, or form, is that wisdom requires action. Our faith requires action. Right? It's not enough to simply know what should be done. We have to do something with what we know. Throughout church history and in church theology, you'll hear these words orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Ortho means right, and doxy means belief. And so you have the right beliefs, the right knowledge, but that should lead us to orthopraxy, which is the right practice or the right actions. I remember a number of years ago getting into my car to run some errands, and it was one of those days where my to-do list was probably more ambitious than it should have been. And I know all the type A people can relate to that, but I was feeling the pinch for time, and as I was pulling out on the main road, I looked down and I saw that light pop up on my dashboard, low gas. Now at the time, I had an old Ford Ranger that didn't have any fancy bells and whistles like many cars have today. And it didn't have that display that says number of miles to empty. Right? All it had was that classic gauge with the needle that was clearly pointing at E. And I saw the E, and instead of thinking empty, I just thought, exciting. That's what E stands for, right? And I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, but when it comes to that gas tank gauge, There are really two types of people in this world. There are those who see this and they think, shoot, like I need to fill up on the way home. And then there are those of you who you see this, and here's what you think. You think, I got this. I got this. And on that day, my reliable, steadfast, unfailing Ford Ranger let me know I don't got this. And I was so frustrated with myself as I sat there on the side of the road calling friends and family members to see if anyone had a gas can and if anyone had time to come and bail me out. And here's the most embarrassing part of the story. I had driven past, I kid you not, no less than 3 gas stations while trying to get my to-do list done. And every time I thought to myself, hey, I should pull in. I should fill up, but I didn't, right? And you might be asking, what's the point of the story? Here's the point. The reason that I ran out of gas on the side of the road, it wasn't a knowledge problem. I knew what needed to be done. The issue, it was not a lack of knowledge, it was a lack of action. Wisdom. Listen, wisdom is knowledge in action. And here's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying a wise person implements the words of Jesus. He's saying it's not enough to just simply hear his words or to just know what he teaches. Wisdom, the wise person, is the one who puts them into practice. Verse 24 tells us that when we put the words of Jesus into practice, then we are like the wise man. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who, don't miss this, built his house on the rock. Now, this metaphor is a little lost on us today because most of us will never build our own home. And when homes are built today, it's amazing, and I'm sure you've seen it as you've driven by construction zones. The process is so streamlined. But back in the first century, building a house, it took time. It was a tedious process that required lots of intentionality and lots of discipline and hard work. And if you wanted to build your house on a solid foundation, excavation was required. You had to, in that day and age, you had to dig down through the sand, through all of these hard, compacted layers of soil. And listen, they didn't have the kind of machinery that we have today. And so it was hard, physical labor. But the result, and everyone at the ancient Near East, they would know this, the result was that it was something that would last. The implication that Jesus is making is that putting his words into practice, listen, it won't always be easy. Putting his words into practice will not always be easy, but it will be worthwhile. It may be hard at times, but it will produce something that lasts. The way of Jesus, it is a firm foundation. And I don't know about you, but when I think about the way of Jesus, when I think about the path of Jesus, I often think, man, I love the end results. I want that destination, but God, maybe, is there a shortcut? Like, Jesus, is there some secret passageway or some Narnia-like portal that I can just step through to avoid all of that hard work part? Like, wouldn't that be nice? If choosing to trust and follow Jesus was like a divine quick fix for life, unfortunately, that's how many people approach faith. Many people have made the mistake that believing that following Jesus is just this divine quick fix. And in fact, maybe that's how you've approached faith. Perhaps you decided to trust Jesus and get baptized, and you thought that once you did, everything would just suddenly be different. But today, you're questioning, doubting. You're still wrestling with things that you thought would vanish, and maybe you're even feeling like you were lied to because life is still hard. But friends, listen, Jesus never promised a quick fix. He promised a firm foundation. And I just want to encourage you. I don't know what you may be walking through, but I want to encourage you, don't stop pursuing God. Listen, keep implementing the words of Jesus. He promises us that if we practice his words, then we will be building something in our life that is of lasting value. In fact, when we build our house on the right foundation, here's what Jesus says in verse 25. He says, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall. Why? Because it had its foundation on the rock. Listen, when we build wisely on the right foundation, listen, there is security even in the midst of uncertainty. When we implement the words of Jesus and when we pattern our lives after his, we can stand firm and we can be confident in what our finish line will look like, even when the doctor shares devastating news. Even when we get that unexpected bill that suddenly comes through, even when the promising opportunity didn't turn out the way you had anticipated, even when your plans completely unravel, even when the weight of life feels like it's just too much to bear, even when every star that you drafted for your fantasy football team is now on injury reserve. Listen, you probably won't win the season, but you can have a house that will not fall because it's on a foundation that will not fail. When we build on the right foundation, when we live in the right direction, then our destination can be known. We can, to some degree, predict our own future. In fact, the context of this passage suggests that Jesus, he's not merely speaking about the storms of life, he's really speaking about the final judgment at the end of our life. And there will come a day when every single one of us will take our last breath. And Jesus is saying that the foundation we choose to build on while we're here on earth, it has eternal implications. And the hope that Jesus is giving is that it is possible to know with certainty what our eternity will look like. A wise person will implement the words of Jesus. But it's important to acknowledge that that's not the only option on the table. There is another way that you can respond to the teachings of Jesus. There's another path that you can follow. Let's continue on in verse 26. It says, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who continues to drive on empty. Let me tell you, after experiencing what it's like to run out of gas, I've now become the other kind of person. When my car hits 3/4 of a tank, I'm immediately thinking like, I need to get gas on the way home tonight. And if for some reason I'm down to a quarter tank, my anxiety is through the roof. But that's obviously not what Jesus is saying in verse 26, right? Here's what he's saying. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Now immediately, the crowd that was sitting there listening to Jesus, they would have winced. His audience knew. I mean, just like we know today, building a house on a foundation of sand, I mean, that's got disaster written all over it. And sure, it might be quicker. It's certainly easier than doing the hard work of digging down to the bedrock, but it's like a house of cards. It's the opposite of what wise people do. I mean, this is living as if our decisions and actions today have no bearing on tomorrow. You know, Jesus did not teach about marriage and finances and sex and prayer and fasting and forgiveness and all of the other significant things that he addresses in the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't teach about all of that just to create some extensive religious lists of do's and don'ts for his sake. No. God is not some cosmic killjoy that is just trying to control you. The opposite is true. God created the world. He created you and me. God knows what will ultimately bring about the greatest joy in human flourishing. And Jesus invites us to follow his way because he is acutely aware that the decisions we make and that the actions we take today, they will shape the kind of life that we live tomorrow. And Jesus wants our tomorrow to be rock solid. Because tomorrow will eventually come, and you know this, we've all lived enough life to know the forecast It's not always beautiful, calm, sunny. In fact, Jesus continues the parable in verse 27. It says, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So Jesus portrays two very different responses that lead to two very different outcomes. Right? A wise person implements the words of Jesus, but a foolish person ignores the words of Jesus. Now, I get that there may be those of you here today that you hear this and maybe you're a bit skeptical. Like you might think, Josh, Jesus was a great guy and all. I love a lot of what he said, but there are some things that can probably be ignored. Like surely some of what he said is a bit outdated, or maybe it's just not that big of a deal anymore. However, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, and I believe that he is, and if our decisions today really do shape where we end up tomorrow, then there isn't anything more significant than how we choose to respond to what Jesus said. Yeah, I grew up in a Christian home. My dad served as a pastor on the staff of a very dynamic and healthy church for 3 decades. And so I grew up knowing about God and the words of Jesus. And at a very young age, I put my faith in Jesus. But like I'm sure many of you have, I went through a very dark and painful season. You know, for me, it was at the end of high school, kind of carrying over into my college years. And I experienced tremendously deep depression and a crippling anxiety that for me led to this crisis of faith. And even though I knew the words of Jesus, I stopped implementing them. And here's the truth. I spiraled. And instead of allowing the way of Jesus to guide me, I stopped swimming upstream and I gave into the current of culture, which really only amplified the pain that I felt. And I watched as my life just became crumbling down around me. My whole life just unraveled. And one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about helping people to follow the path of Jesus is because I know where the other path can lead. Listen, whether we want to accept it or not, our decisions and our actions, they have very real consequences. And a foolish person ignores the words of Jesus, but a wise person will implement the words of Jesus even if they feel difficult, even if they're hard. They're the words of life. Yeah, I can't read this passage without thinking about that old hymn. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness, and on Christ, the solid rock I stand, because all other ground is sinking sand. So friends, how do we begin moving in the right direction? Like, what does this look like practically in our lives? You know, as much as I would love to just prescriptively offer, you know, this golden ticket idea for all of us, the reality is all of us have had drastically different life experiences that have shaped who we are, where we've been, where we're at today. And we're all in a different season of life and in different stages of our journey. And so the reality is there's no one thing that will get us all moving in the right direction. But as we close today, I do believe that there are some questions we can ask to help us to really objectively identify what it is that we ought to do. And here's the first question that you can ask is this: what has God asked me to do that I have been unwilling to do? What has God asked you to do that maybe you've just been unwilling to do? Maybe the step that God's asking you to take is to forgive that person that hurt you, to make that call, to send that text. Maybe it's to apologize to someone you hurt. Maybe God's leading you to live more relationally and start a small group or jump into one here at the church. Or perhaps maybe God's asking you to take a step of faith in your finances and to live more generously. For some of you, you've been following Jesus for some time, but you've been unwilling to do the very first thing that Jesus tells us to do when we give our lives to him, which is to be baptized. Here at Eastside, we take a very literal view of baptism. We take people down into the water, representing that Jesus was buried in the grave for 3 days, and then we bring you up out of the water to identify you with his resurrection and to celebrate the promise of resurrection that awaits all of us who have put our faith and our trust in him. And as I mentioned earlier, baptism, it's not a divine quick fix, but here's what I can promise you. God blesses obedience. And building on a firm foundation, it means obeying Jesus' commands. It's the very first thing that he tells us to do. And so if you've made the decision to follow Jesus and trust him with your life, but you've never made the public declaration of faith through baptism, I just want to ask you today, what are you waiting for? In fact, this weekend, at every single Eastside campus, we are providing people with the opportunity to be baptized. And so if you're near an Eastside campus, I'm telling you, get there. Like right now, get in your car, drive to the campus. We would love to celebrate with you. We've got everything that you need. And if you're not near an Eastside campus, let us know. We would love to be able to help you take that step. But again, the question, what has God asked me to do that I've been unwilling to do? Here's another way to ask the question. What has God asked me to stop doing that I continue to do? Now, I'm willing to bet that for many of us, we could answer these questions without much thought. Chances are we've already felt the stirring in our hearts of what it is that we need to do or what we need to stop doing. I know in my life, I am often very aware of what I should do long before it actually happens. Remember, the foolish person ignores the words of Jesus, but the wise person implements the words of Jesus. But I want us to take this a step further. I want you to consider this question to help paint some perspective, and it's this question. If I continue to do what I'm currently doing, what will life look like in a year? Again, all of our journeys are unique. And as you think about the road that you're on, as you look into the rearview mirror, so to speak, where is the road that you're currently traveling going to take you a year from now? And if you're willing to take the time to be honest and really evaluate the different facets of your life, this is such a revealing question. And then once you've asked that question, here's what you can ask. If I continue to do what I'm currently doing, what will life look like in a decade? What will it look like in a decade? Here's the reality. You may be making decisions today that don't have any real consequences a year from now. But if you look further out, you may see that what you're doing today is going to prohibit you from experiencing what you actually want to experience in a decade or two. If you continue to do what you're doing, what will your life look like in a decade? If I continue to do what I'm currently doing relationally, maritally, in marriage or relationships, financially, spiritually, all of the other Ali's, what will life look like? In Proverbs 27:12 tells us the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. The wise see danger and take refuge, but the foolish keep going and pay the penalty. Friends, if you continue to do what you're currently doing, what will life look like tomorrow? I hope that we will all be brutally honest with ourselves as we ask these questions, because our direction determines our destination. Let's pray. God, we're so grateful for Jesus and for his teachings, the way that you have revealed yourself through him. And God, I pray that as we look to the teachings and the words of Jesus, God, would you help us to be wise and to implement them in our lives? God, would you help us to build our lives on the rock, on the solid foundation? Because God, all other ground is sinking sand. And we want the best in life. We want what you desire for us, which is to live life abundantly and with fullness. And so, God, would you help us? Would you guide us by your Spirit? And when we live our lives fully surrendered to you, God, whatever step it is that you're asking us to take, would you give us the boldness and would you encourage us in it? And God, would we give you all glory and honor as we seek to live out your purpose in our life. We love you, we trust you, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.